We are sorry. The number you have dialed has been...
In 2015, student Michael Andrews of the University of Southern California had left his dorm room with his roommate Steve to go to a frat party off campus. On the way to the party, Steve had realized he left his phone in the dorm room, but already in the Uber to the party, they didn't bother going back to the dorm. At some point during the party, while the two friends had separated to mingle with other friends and acquaintances, Michael's phone began to ring. It was from Steve's number. He picked up and heard Steve's voice on the other end, covered by a mask of static. Even in the loud party, he could distinguish the voice of his roommate saying, "Come back to the room." Then the call ended. With that, Michael left the party and Ubered back to the campus dorms, trying to call Steve back and text him, but he wasn't getting any responses. When Michael got back to the dorm room, he didn't find Steve inside. Strangely though, he did find Steve's phone sitting on his bed. Upon checking the notifications on the screen, Michael saw the notifications of all his texts and calls on the screen. It wasn't until an hour later that Steve returned to the room looking for Michael after hearing that he left. And this was when he told Michael that he never called him and that he never had his phone. What made this even stranger was that Steve's phone had no record of making a call to Michael, yet Michael's phone had a record of receiving a call and having a 15-second conversation. The phone company wasn't able to trace a call from Steve inside, and nobody was found hiding in their dorm room or anything like that. In 1970, 25-year-old Donna Lass worked as a nurse at the first aid station of a casino in South Lake Tahoe, California. One day, Donna's boss and landlord both received calls from an unidentified man who claimed she was dealing with an illness in the family and would be out of town for a while. Donna's boss became suspicious, so he contacted her mother, who confirmed that story was a lie. Donna's car was found parked outside her apartment, but there was no trace of her anywhere. The last sign of her was an entry she'd made in her logbook near the end of her final shift. The entry looked unfinished, as if someone had possibly interrupted her. No one could figure out Donna's whereabouts or the identity of the caller until the San Francisco Chronicle received a mysterious postcard 6 months later. The postcard was the latest in a long line of cryptic messages from the Zodiac Killer. The killer made no direct reference to Donna, but hinted that he had murdered and buried his 12th victim in Lake Tahoe. It didn't take a detective to make the connection between this note and Donna's disappearance. The postcard provided a lot of possible clues regarding Donna's whereabouts, but a search of the area turned up nothing. Something complicates a connection between the Zodiac Killer and Donna though, and that's the fact that the Zodiac Killer was not known for hiding bodies. So if he wasn't responsible, the whereabouts of Donna's body and who tried to hide her disappearance remain a mystery. In 2008, 19-year-old college student Brendan Swanson was driving home after a night out when he crashed into a ditch on a gravel road in the middle of nowhere in Minnesota. Knowing how dangerous of a predicament he found himself in, and probably aware he was in a cliché horror movie setup, he called his parents and asked for a ride. However, his parents had trouble finding him, and when arriving to the location he provided, they couldn't find his car, so they got back on the phone for over 45 minutes trying to find him as he described his location. Swanson claimed he could see lights from a nearby town and was heading in that direction, but things took a turn for the worse when he suddenly yelled, "Oh shit." Before his father could even scold his son for using that language on the phone with him, the call cut off, and that's the last anyone ever heard from Brendan. Even with hundreds of volunteers and 30 dogs searching, only his car was found. So what happened to him? What did he see that made him go, "Oh shit," before abruptly hanging up? A few years back, a Reddit user named Stacy Kolupski shared the experience of her brother who would get a call on his cell phone around 2 to 3 a.m. every night. He would answer it every time to hear this hellish sounding noise that he described as a static mixed with screams. He changed his cell phone number after a month of this and it stopped. Then after a week or so, it began again, with the exact same noise at the exact same time. Finally, one day he decided to backdial the call, and an old man picked up who had no idea what he was talking about. If he didn't answer, it would call a few more times, but no messages were ever left. He decided to say screw it, and ended his contract with his phone company, switched to a new one, and then got another new number. And exactly what he feared had happened. The screaming static calls continued after a short delay. By this time he was terrified every night. Unsure why this was happening, he backdialed the number again and got a different person, who also had no idea what he was talking about. Around this time, Stacy's brother lost his job and his phone, which was now disconnected, meaning the calls of course stopped. One day, Stacy's mom asked her to listen to a weird message she got on her home phone. It was the static screaming. They showed her brother, and he of course freaked out. He backdialed the number again, and it said the number was disconnected this time. They never heard from it again after that. In the 1970s, Bashir Kaushaki opened a successful restaurant in Washington, D.C., and for over a decade enjoyed nothing but success. But in 1983, he became the target of a non-stop stream of threatening phone calls that came several times a day, every day. Usually harassment similar to this will eventually stop on its own as the harassers get bored and move on to something else. But Kaushaki was harassed by these phone calls for nearly a decade. The caller would eventually be nicknamed Lonfont, which is French for the child. The nickname was presumed to reference the caller's eventual imitation of a little girl. Anyone associated with Kaushaki in any way was a target, from his pregnant spouse to his restaurant employees. The harassment was one day elevated from simply phone calls to physical harassment when the Star of David was scratched all over Kaushaki's Mercedes. When he traveled to Philadelphia to visit his sister, things got so bad that he suffered a mental breakdown and committed himself to a psychiatric ward. But even still, the calls continued to his restaurant. The FBI eventually placed a trace on the phone to confirm whether Lonfont was a delusion or not, and what they found out put how bad this was into perspective. The calls were coming from different payphones at such a high frequency that it would have been impossible for only one person to have been making these calls. The Lonfont callers was a plot orchestrated by multiple people for the express purpose of harassing Kaushaki to insanity, but it was never figured out what the motive was. All the way back in 1931, there was a man named William Wallace who worked as a London insurance agent and had an obsession for playing chess in his free time. One night, Wallace showed up for a chess club meeting and found a telephone message waiting for him. The sender wanted to meet at 7:30 the following night so he could purchase an insurance policy. The next night, Wallace traveled across town and discovered that the address provided didn't exist. So he headed back home, most likely convinced that he was the victim of some dumb prank. But when he got home, he found his wife Julia's body had been beaten to death in the living room. The mysterious caller was the obvious suspect, but after an investigation, police determined that the caller was actually William Wallace himself. Authorities argued that Wallace had left the message to fabricate an alibi. He killed his wife, hopped in a streetcar, drove around for an hour, then went home to supposedly discover his wife's body. This argument was invalid as it was completely impossible for Wallace to have committed the murder, given he wouldn't have been able to return quick enough. The jury found Wallace guilty of the murder anyway, but luckily the Court of Criminal Appeal immediately overturned the conviction. The killer was never identified, but the prime suspect was a former employee of Wallace's insurance firm, who allegedly asked his wife to provide him a fake alibi and was seen wearing bloody gloves and hosing down his car on the night of the murder. Jason Alexander would frequently get calls to his house for a woman named Tanya. It didn't seem like a big deal since Tanya had the same last name as Jason's family and it was a common name from where they were from. When Jason and his family moved across the city and phone books gradually stopped being the go-to way of finding somebody's number, the calls for Tanya gradually stopped, and after a while, the Alexander family forgot about the Tanya woman. It was about 4 years later that she popped up in their lives again. Jason was driving home from work one afternoon and was greeted by a pretty grisly car wreck at the turn to his house. 2 cars had collided, and one had wrapped itself around the signage pole that had the house numbers and directions on it, one of which was his house number. Several days later, he got a call from the police. They asked if Tanya was at his residence. Her car was found wrapped around a pole down the street from Jason's house, and she was nowhere to be found at the accident site. He had never heard anything about her ever again. In 1965, the young woman you're looking at, named Judith Hiams, disappeared from her hometown of Coral Gables, Florida. Everyone feared the worst when her abandoned car was found in Atlanta with blood in the backseat. Judith was pregnant and recently went through a divorce. She allegedly made arrangements to get an illegal abortion from a Hungarian doctor named George Hajdu. He was charged with conspiring to perform the abortion, but skipped bail and fled the country. After this, the case was forgotten for a quarter century, until it was rejuvenated by a series of bizarre phone calls. In 1990, the Coral Gables police captain Chuck Smith received a message from an Omaha, Nebraska radio host claiming he had information about Judith's disappearance. Smith called the host back, but the host was completely confused. The host said he never made the call, and he knew nothing at all about Judith. Smith soon received another anonymous call claiming Judith was alive in Omaha. Smith knew nothing about the case, but he had recently traveled to Omaha to deliver a lecture at a police academy, and he started to wonder if this was a prank. Smith got a third anonymous call from someone who claimed to be an FBI informant who had recently spent time with Dr. Hadu in Hungary. They even provided an old phone number for Hadu that checked out. Smith was confused, and with such a baffling case, he took the story to the TV show Unsolved Mysteries. Days after the Judith Hiams episode was broadcast, Smith got an anonymous letter confirming what many people suspected all along. Judith died during an illegal abortion and wound up in a watery grave. While that's the logical solution, it doesn't account for all the strange calls. The callers and writer have not been identified, the doctor has not been found, and Judith's body was never recovered.